Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander into one of those corners of history that no one really asked for. But here we are. You've dimmed the lights, you've hopefully put away your phone, except for the one you're using to listen to me drone on. And now we're going to talk about something that is both boring and oddly comforting. Ink. Yes, ink. Specifically, how medieval monks spent way too much of their lives making it. And yes, it really did take forever. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ink, that's not exactly a thrill ride. And you'd be right. But that's the whole point. We're not here for action. We're here for something so flat and so tedious that it could lull even a caffeinated squirrel into sleep. So, let's settle in, breathe a little, and float into the monastic world of quills, parchment, and endless grinding of oak galls. Because monks had patience, and, frankly, way too much time on their hands. So, picture this. It's the 12th century. You're in a cold, stone monastery somewhere in northern France. The walls are damp. The only heating is the vague body warmth of a dozen men who all smell faintly of cabbage. The day begins at some ungodly hour, literally before dawn, with prayers, chanting, and more prayers. And tucked away in the scriptorium, the sacred office of book copying, some poor monk is hunched over a desk with a quill, a candle, and the looming knowledge that he's about to spend the next, 40 years, copying the Psalms, by hand, letter by letter. But before he can even scratch out the divine in principio orat verbum, he needs ink. Which means someone, possibly him, possibly another unlucky brother, has to make it. And making ink in the Middle Ages was not like buying a nice Pilot G2 pack at the stationery shop. No, this was a laborious process involving dead insects, rotting plants, mysterious powders, and, of course, God's favorite gift to mankind, oak galls. Now, if you don't know what an oak gall is, don't worry. Nobody ever talks about them unless they're a historian or an entomologist with too much free time. Basically, when a certain type of wasp lays its eggs inside an oak tree, the tree reacts by growing this weird round lump on its branches. That lump is called a gall. It looks a little like a tumor, and it's filled with tannic acid, which medieval people quickly figured out you could use to make very durable, dark ink. Of course, that meant you had to go out and actually collect these things. So imagine, if you will, a group of monks in long robes, wandering around an oak forest, poking at branches, and filling baskets with weird knobbly plant tumors. Very holy work indeed. But gathering galls was only step one. The next stage was crushing them, not in some sleek industrial machine. No, just with mortar and pestle, like some giant, boring medieval cooking show. Grind the galls down into a coarse powder, add water, stir, and then, you guessed it, wait. Because nothing in a monastery happened quickly. You let it soak for days, sometimes weeks, because apparently even ink needed to take a vow of patience. Now, the problem was, gall juice alone made a weak, watery sort of brown liquid, not exactly ideal for the word of God. So the monks had to mix in other ingredients to get a strong black ink that would actually stick to parchment and not fade the moment someone sneezed on it. This usually involved iron salts, which, if you didn't have a handy chemical supplier, you got from scraping rusty nails or boiling old bits of iron in vinegar until they dissolved. It was like alchemy, but with more prayers and fewer explosions. Well, usually. And this is where it gets kind of tragic. Because even once the ink was made, it didn't stay nice forever. Oh no. Medieval ink had a bad habit of eating right through the parchment over time. So a monk might spend 20 years of his life copying the Bible, only for his ink to slowly corrode the page like some kind of passive-aggressive acid. You can still see this today in old manuscripts where the text has literally burned holes in the parchment. Imagine dedicating your life to the glory of God, and your ink just dissolves it. That's divine irony. But we're not in a rush here, so let's back up. Because before the ink ever touched the page, parchment itself had to be prepared. And yes, it's exactly what you think. Animal skins, sheep, cows, goats, which meant more waiting, more scraping, more smelly, tedious, back-breaking work. So not only was the ink slow, but the page it went on was slow too. The entire process of producing a single book was like watching paint dry. Except first you had to invent the paint. Let's pause here for a moment. You might be drifting already, and that's good. But if you're still with me, let me drop in a small thought. Imagine the mental state of a monk day after day, grinding oak galls, boiling iron, stirring sticky vats of dark liquid, just so Brother Matthew could copy another psalm. These men genuinely believed they were saving souls through ink. Not by preaching, not by fighting, but by sitting quietly and making ink, which is noble, yes, but also just a little tragicomic. And this is why it took forever. Because unlike us, they weren't measuring efficiency. They weren't saying, how many copies can I pump out today? No, their goal was closer to, how slowly and prayerfully can I do this so that God doesn't smite me for bad handwriting? Which is why medieval manuscripts are beautiful, and also why they took approximately 3 eternities to finish. Now, I could just tell you they made ink from oak galls and iron salts and call it a day. But that would be far too merciful. And you didn't click on a video called Boring History for Sleep for Mercy. So instead, let's meander through every boring step at a snail's pace. Because we have time. First, Gall collection season. Best time of year. Late summer to autumn. Why? Because that's when the wasp larvae inside the galls have done their work and the little plant tumors are nice and tannin-rich. The monks would head out into the forest, though to be fair, sometimes they just sent peasants, because why waste valuable prayer time picking lumps off trees? They'd gather the galls, sometimes even buying them in bulk from merchants who specialized in such things. Yes, gall dealers existed. A whole economy around tree warts. Medieval capitalism was wild. Once gathered, the galls had to dry. Not in fancy ovens, just by sitting around in baskets until they were brittle. Then the pounding began. Mortar, pestle, rhythmic grinding. It was probably the closest thing to a gym workout these monks ever got. Grind too fine, and it turned into dust that clogged everything. Too coarse, and it wouldn't soak properly. Somewhere in between was the sweet spot. So the galls have been gathered. They've been dried. They're sitting there, looking like little shriveled marbles of tree disease. The monks, or their unlucky assistants, begin the grinding process. Imagine the sound, stone pestle on stone mortar, over and over, hour after hour. There's something oddly hypnotic about it. Except, of course, if you're the one doing it. In which case, it's mostly sore arms and backache. But let's not forget, this wasn't some quick little chore. It wasn't like tossing instant coffee in a cup. This was more like brewing tea with the patience of a saint. You'd grind the galls, put them in a big jar of water, and then leave them for days. maybe weeks, depending on how strong you wanted the ink. Imagine how thrilled Brother Thomas was, checking on the jar each morning, only to realize nothing had happened except the water now looked slightly browner. Inspiring, and of course, because monks loved rules, there were instructions on exactly how to do this. Some medieval recipe books, the kind kept in monasteries, spelled out the process with all the excitement of a tax document. Take galls, crush them, soak in clear water, then add vitriol, and that was it. No illustrations, no jokes. Just a flat list, as if the authors knew future readers would be bored and wanted to preserve that vibe for eternity. Ah yes, vitriol. That's our next step. In modern terms, vitriol usually means sulfuric acid, but in the medieval recipe book sense, green vitriol usually meant iron sulfate. How did they get it? By doing what monks did best, waiting around for stuff to rust. You could literally leave some scrap iron in vinegar or even just in damp conditions. Scrape off the crusty flakes, and boom, vitriol. If you've ever neglected a garden tool outside for a few weeks, congratulations, you've made medieval ink ingredient number 2. So now we've got a rusty sludge and a bitter tea made of oak tumors. Combine them and magic happens. The tannic acid from the galls reacts with the iron, and suddenly you've got a liquid that looks dark, serious, and biblical. It was still watery at this stage, but already you could imagine it sticking to parchment in a way that said, "Thou shalt not erase me," which was the point. This ink wasn't meant to be casual. This was ink for God, ink for eternity, or at least until the parchment dissolved. Of course, monks being monks, they couldn't just leave it there. No, they added extras. Gum arabic, for instance, which sounds fancy, but was basically hardened sap from the acacia tree. You'd grind that up, dissolve it in the mix, and it gave the ink body. Without gum arabic, the ink would spread all over the parchment like a toddler with finger paint. With gum, it stayed in place, nice and crisp. Where did they get gum arabic? Often through trade. That's right, somewhere in the Mediterranean, someone was harvesting tree sap, shipping it in little lumps, and eventually, centuries later, it ended up in a monk's jar of ink in a cold abbey in Germany. Globalization, but make it boring. And still, we're not done. Because once the ink was mixed, it had to be strained. Through cloth, carefully. Because you didn't want little chunks of gall pulp clogging your quill halfway through writing the Gospel of John. Imagine the frustration. You've written 10,000 letters perfectly, and then one chunk of oak mush jams your pen. That's how heresies start. Let's float for a second to the quills. Because it's all connected. You can't really talk about ink without quills. And yes, monks made those too. Goose feathers were the standard. Strong, flexible, and plentiful. The process of making a quill was, you guessed it, long and fiddly. First, you had to harden the feather by sticking it in hot sand. Then you scraped off the greasy outer layer. Then you cut the nib with a little knife. If you messed up the angle, congratulations, you had a useless feather. Start again. Now imagine, after all that effort, making parchment, brewing ink, preparing quills, you still hadn't written a single word. The medieval book was a monument to waiting. But let's not wander too far. Back to ink. So we've strained it. We've added gum, arabic, maybe even a pinch of other ingredients if you wanted to get fancy, like wine, for instance. Yes, sometimes monks added a splash of wine to ink, partly as a preservative, partly because wine was basically their version of multi-purpose cleaning fluid, but mostly, I suspect, because it gave them an excuse to test the wine first. Brother Anselm, why is this ink so weak? Because Brother Benedict drank the preservative again. Once the ink was done, it had to be stored, usually in little horn flasks or ceramic jars. Not too big, because ink went bad. It could mold or dry out, or just turn weirdly chunky. So they kept it in small amounts. The storage containers were sometimes plugged with wax or cork. Very fancy stuff, and always handled carefully, because spilling a jar of ink in the scriptorium was basically a cardinal sin. Now, you might ask, was this the only kind of ink monks used? Good question. The answer is, mostly yes. The Gall ink was the workhorse. Dark, durable, serious. But sometimes they used colored inks too. Red, made from cinnabar or red lead. Blue, made from Lapis Lazuli if you were rich, or woad if you were poor. Green, from verdigris, which is just copper corrosion. Again with the rust theme. Basically, if it grew mold, corroded, or oozed from a rock. Monks tried turning it into ink at some point, but black was the standard. And making it, our Gallian friend, was slow, smelly, and endless. You can see why it took forever. Now imagine this process repeated year after year by different monks in different abbeys. Across Europe, tens of thousands of hours spent just grinding, soaking, stirring, straining, all so that one more page of one more psalter could exist. If nothing else, it's a testament to persistence, or possibly boredom. Either way, the result was the foundation of medieval literacy. Without that ink, we wouldn't have Dante, Chaucer, or any of the marginal doodles of snails fighting knights, which, let's be honest, are the real treasures of medieval manuscripts. But let's go even slower, because we can picture Brother Matthew. He's on ink duty this week. He trudges into the little workshop where jars of half-fermented gall water line the shelves. He picks one up, shakes it gently. The liquid inside sloshes darkly, smelling faintly of vinegar and decay. He pours it through a cloth into another jar. Then he sprinkles in the green vitriol, watching it fizz faintly as it turns darker. He stirs with a wooden stick, muttering a prayer. Not because God cares about ink chemistry, but because monks prayed for literally everything. Then he adds a pinch of gum arabic, already dissolved in water. He stirs again. He tests it with a quill on a scrap of parchment. It's thin, to light. Back it goes to soak another few days, and so on, endlessly. So, you've got your ink bubbling away nicely in its jar, looking dark and serious. But here's the thing. Just because it looked promising didn't mean it would behave on the page. Monks had to test their batches constantly. Dip a quill, make a few strokes on scrap parchment, watch it dry. Sometimes it came out too thin and watery. Sometimes it went on black but dried into a sad, greyish smear that looked less like Holy Scripture and more like you spilled weak tea on your page. And then there were the complete disasters. Imagine you've spent 2 weeks patiently soaking oak galls, crushing them, mixing in your iron, adding gum arabic with great devotion, and then the whole mixture spoils. A layer of fuzzy mold forms on top. The smell is indescribable. At that point, you had 2 options. Try to scrape the mold off and pray it still worked, or throw it out and start again. Knowing monks, they probably scraped. Waste not, want not. especially when every ingredient took days of effort to get. And even if you had a successful ink, it didn't mean the book you wrote with it would last. Iron Gall ink is notorious for its long-term betrayal. At first, it looked crisp and black, but the acid content slowly ate into the parchment, burning right through the page. You can still see medieval manuscripts today where the letters are basically little holes. Imagine being Brother Matthew, pouring your soul into copying the Psalms, only for your handwriting to slowly self-destruct over the centuries. Divine irony indeed. Let's meander into the recipes a bit more, because, well, we've got time. One recipe from a 15th century English manuscript says, take 3 ounces of Galls, bruise them well, and put them into a pot with a quart of rainwater, and let them stand 9 days. Then take 4 ounces of green copperas, that's iron sulfate, and beat it small, and put it into the same water, and stir it well. Then take 2 ounces of gum Arabic, and beat it small, and put it therein. Then stir all these together. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why rainwater? Simple. Monks didn't always trust well water, and they didn't have distilled water sitting around. Rainwater was considered cleaner. Never mind that it fell straight through the monastery roof, probably full of pigeon droppings. Still better than swampy pond water, I guess. Other recipes got even fussier. Some insisted you soak the galls in wine instead of water. Others added little extras like vinegar, salt, or even honey. Everyone had their own secret recipe, like medieval grandmothers arguing over stew. And of course, every monastery swore their ink was the best. Our Psalter's ink is blacker than yours. Petty, but true. Then there's the matter of time. If you follow that English recipe, you're already waiting 9 days just for the galls to soak. That's 9 days of doing nothing but glancing at your jar of murky water, hoping God blesses the tannins. Then more time for the gum to dissolve. Then testing, straining, storing. By the time your ink was actually ready to use, a month might have passed. And that's if you didn't mess it up and have to start over. This is why I said it took forever. Making ink was like one long lesson in patience. Monks were already experts at sitting around in silence. But even they probably got bored waiting for gum Arabic to fully dissolve. Let's drift for a second into gum Arabic itself, because this is another ingredient that sounds simple but wasn't. Gum Arabic was imported from Africa, often through Italian merchants. It came in little yellowish lumps that looked like hardened resin. The monks would crush it, soak it, stir it, strain it, all to get a sticky solution that acted as the glue of the ink. Without gum, the ink just didn't sit right. But too much gum, and suddenly your ink was so thick it clogged the quill. Balance was everything, and storage was another nightmare. Ink dried out quickly. Leave a jar open, and within a day or two it could start forming a crust. Then you'd be chipping away at it with a stick, muttering under your breath. If it got too thick, you had to water it down. But water it too much, and suddenly it's weak again. It was like maintaining a sourdough starter, except instead of bread, you just got more work. Now, let's talk about failure on the page, because every scribe dreaded that moment. You dip your quill, start writing, and the ink behaves badly. Sometimes it spread too wide and bled into the parchment fibers. Sometimes it just slid right off because the parchment wasn't prepped properly. Sometimes it dried so faint you couldn't read it. Imagine having to scrape off an entire paragraph with a knife because your ink batch was a dud. Yes, Monks literally scraped parchment clean and rewrote on it. That's how we got palimpsests, recycled manuscripts. And this brings us to the human side of things, because ink wasn't just chemistry. It was tied up with human frustration. You can almost feel the irritation in some marginal notes scribes left. This parchment is terrible. The ink is bad. I am so tired. These little complaints survive in the margins of holy texts, written by exhausted monks whose ink kept betraying them. Centuries later, we get to chuckle at their suffering. History is cruel like that. But hey, let's not get too dramatic. This is still sleepy history. So let's glide back into the monotony. Picture again that cold monastery scriptorium. A row of desks, candles guttering, the faint scratching of quills, and somewhere in the corner, a monk tending a jar of ink like it's a fragile child. He stirs, he sighs, he tests a line, he stirs again, day after day, week after week. All for something we'd now buy in a 99-cent Bic pen. And yet, in a way, that slowness was the point. The ink making, the copying, the waiting, it was all part of a rhythm. Monastic life was built around repetition. The same prayers, the same chants, the same chores. Making ink wasn't just busy work. It was devotion. The patience was the prayer. The boredom was the sacrifice. The ink itself was just a medium. If you're still awake after listening to monks stir oak galls for an hour, congratulations. Tonight we're moving one step further in the process of making books so boringly slow it could cure insomnia. Parchment. Yes, parchment. Otherwise known as animal skin that monks lovingly tortured into thin, smooth sheets so they could write their god-approved doodles of snails fighting knights. Now, I don't want to alarm you, but every medieval manuscript you've ever seen, every beautiful illuminated gospel, every book of hours, every long, long sermon, was once part of an animal, usually a sheep, sometimes a goat, occasionally a calf, if you wanted the good stuff, which means every time you look at a manuscript, you are, in fact, staring at a carefully flattened, scraped and stretched bit of medieval livestock. Cozy bedtime thought, right? So let's take this slow. Imagine a medieval monk in the 12th century, standing in a damp courtyard with a sheep carcass. He doesn't see dinner. He sees potential pages. First step, skin the animal. Carefully, because holes and cuts meant wasted parchment. Then, once the skin is off, you've got a floppy, greasy mess. Not exactly ready for scripture, so you soak it in lime water. For days, the smell, oh, just rancid, slimy flesh slowly loosening its hair. Nothing says holiness like a vat of dissolving sheepskin. After soaking, the real work begins, scraping. Out comes a crescent-shaped knife, and the monk starts scraping off hair, fat, and whatever else is clinging, over and over, pushing the blade across the hide, pulling away goo until it's sort of clean, but not too hard or you'll gouge holes. Too soft, and the hair stays stuck. Again, balance was everything. And of course, this was all done by hand. No shortcuts. Just endless scraping, like exfoliating a very reluctant corpse. Next step, stretching. The skin is laced onto a wooden frame, pulled tight like a drum, then left to dry. Not too fast, or it cracks. Not too slow, or it molds. Every day, monks would come by and scrape a little more, pull it tighter, scrape again. You can imagine the sound. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Knife on skin. A whole courtyard filled with drying hides, flapping in the wind like ghostly laundry. Very atmospheric. Very holy once dry, it's sanded with pumice. Yes, literally sanded, to smooth out bumps and make it thin. You want it just translucent enough that you can see faintly through, but not so thin that your ink eats a hole straight through. Again, trial and error. Some sheets turned out silky smooth, others were blotchy disasters, and yet all of them were destined to be written on. Now, let's pause and think about the math. How many animals did it take to make one Bible? Answer: a lot. Depending on size, a single large Bible might need 200 to 300 sheep. That's an entire flock turned into one book. So next time someone tells you medieval monks were peaceful vegetarians, just remember, behind every illuminated gospel was a sheep massacre, and parchment wasn't cheap. Calfskin, called vellum, was the luxury version. Silky, smooth, perfect for fancy manuscripts. If oak gall ink was the standard tool, vellum was like the MacBook Pro of parchment. Rich patrons wanted vellum. Poorer monasteries made do with rougher sheep or goat skin. You can literally see the difference in manuscripts. Some pages look clean and elegant. Others still have veins, scars, or hair follicles visible. Nothing like reading a holy text with a cow scar running through the margins. But let's not rush, because the point here is slowness. Imagine Brother Peter, assigned to parchment duty. Day after day, he stands at the frame, scraping another hide. His hands ache. His knife dulls. The smell of lime water clings to him. He probably wonders why God couldn't have just invented paper sooner. Spoiler, paper existed in China for centuries by then. But Europe was fashionably late to everything. Still, he scrapes. He sands, he stretches, until, at last, he has a pile of sheets ready for the scriptorium. Weeks of work, just to produce a few dozen pages. And this was constant. Monasteries were manuscript factories, if factories moved at the speed of slugs. Ink, parchment, quills, it all had to be made, on site, or bought at great expense. Every book was an investment of time, labor, and animal carcasses, which is why monks treated them with such reverence. Lose a book, and you've lost a small flock and half a decade of someone's eyesight. And of course, parchment had quirks. Some pages were smoother on one side, rougher on the other. You can still feel it today if you run your hand over a medieval manuscript. Flesh side versus hair side. Sometimes you even get faint outlines of where the hair follicles were. Congratulations, you're petting a long dead sheep while reading Augustine. Cozy errors happened too. A slip of the knife, a tear while stretching, too much pumice. Suddenly that expensive sheet was useless, or maybe not useless. Sometimes monks stitched holes shut with thread. Sometimes they just wrote around the tear, because when parchment took weeks to prepare, you didn't waste it. Even the ugliest sheet got used. Imagine spending hours illuminating a capital letter on a page with a big hole right in the middle. Divine patience. And here's the kicker. This process didn't just take forever. It stayed basically the same for centuries. From the early Middle Ages to the Renaissance, parchment making barely changed. Different monasteries, different hides, same scraping, same stretching. It was tradition, and also just the only way they knew how. So yes, ink took forever. Parchment took forever. Together, they formed the slowest publishing industry in history. And yet, because of that slowness, medieval manuscripts feel strangely alive. You can almost sense the sheep behind the page, the monk behind the knife, the endless patience behind the words. So, let's imagine you're a novice monk, fresh off the boat, or more likely, fresh off your parents dumping you at the monastery gates because they had too many sons and someone had to serve God. You were probably hoping for a life of chanting, quiet prayers, maybe sneaking an extra turnip from the refectory. But instead, you've been handed a crescent knife and pointed toward a sagging sheep hide. Surprise, you're on parchment duty. Congratulations, it's not glamorous work. In fact, it's the monastery equivalent of being assigned toilet duty forever. But parchment had to come from somewhere, and until Europe figured out mass papermaking, animal skins were the way to go. And unlike paper, parchment didn't rot quickly, didn't crumble with a little damp, and could survive centuries if stored halfway decently, which is why, inconveniently, a manuscript made in the 12th century can still exist, while the notebook you bought at Walmart last year is already falling apart at the binding. Now, let's break down the steps again, slower this time. Because why not double down? Step 1, skinning the animal. This wasn't usually done by the monks themselves. Most monasteries bought hides from local tanners. The tanner would handle the bloody work, because monks liked their hands holy, not covered in sheep guts. Still, they sometimes did it themselves if they were out in the sticks. And here's the fun part. Not every animal was skinned for parchment. Some hides were too scarred, too mangy, or too thick. The good ones were chosen like fine wine. Except instead of sniffing a cork, you inspected whether this sheep had fewer bug bites. Step 2. Soaking. Into the lime water vat it goes. Picture a row of wooden barrels, each holding skins bubbling away like a medieval horror soup. The lime water loosened hair and fat, but it also left a smell you probably didn't want near your lunch, which unfortunately was usually nearby because monasteries weren't exactly sprawling industrial complexes. Imagine eating your gruel while the faint whiff of rotting goatskin drifts in. Appetite ruined. Step 3. Scraping. Here's where it gets tactile. The monk would lay the skin on a curved wooden beam and use a lunellum, a crescent knife, to scrape away hair. Now, this took hours, and not fun hours. The kind where your shoulders ache, your wrists cramp, and you start wondering if divine inspiration is really worth it. The skin had to be scraped evenly, or else it dried into lumpy parchment. An uneven parchment meant the scribe later cursed your name under his breath as his quill snagged in a rough patch. Monastic teamwork at its finest. Step 4. Stretching. Remember the drying frame? The skin was laced into it with cords, tugged taut until it looked like a macabre trampoline. This is when you really hoped your knots were good, because if a cord snapped, the skin sagged, wrinkled, or tore. And guess what? Back to square one. Weeks of work undone. There's a reason parchment makers were cranky. Step 5. Sanding. Out came pumice stone, the medieval equivalent of fine grit sandpaper. They'd rub and rub, evening out the surface. If you've ever sanded wood, you know how mind-numbing this can be. Now imagine doing it on sheep hide while muttering prayers in Latin. Gloria Patri. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Hours pass. Days pass. The hide slowly, reluctantly, becomes usable parchment. But wait, there's more. Because parchment wasn't uniform. Each piece had a personality. Calfskin vellum was buttery smooth, practically glowing. Goatskin was tougher, sometimes with visible ridges. Sheepskin was, well, sheepy, and scribes had to adapt. Quills behaved differently on different textures. Ink soaked in too much on rough parchment, or sat annoyingly on top of smooth vellum, waiting for your sleeve to smudge it. Nothing like ruining a page of sacred text with one clumsy elbow. And yes, sometimes hair stayed on the parchment. You could be copying Augustine and brush your hand across a faintly bristly patch. Imagine a holy manuscript that feels like stroking a badly shaved poodle. Divine indeed. Now, one of the most boring but strangely fascinating things about parchment is how much it reveals about economy and scale. Monks didn't just make a sheet here and there. Whole workshops existed, cranking out hide after hide. And remember, books were huge projects. One gospel book might take 150 A full Bible could eat through 300 sheep. And these weren't small animals either. Each hide gave you only a few usable sheets once trimmed, which means monasteries needed connections with tanners, shepherds, and local markets just to keep the book machine running. So parchment wasn't just craft, it was supply chain management. Medieval Amazon Prime, but for dead goats. Except your delivery took months, smelled like lime water, and occasionally arrived with holes. Let's not forget the quirks that make manuscripts so weirdly personal. Holes. Yes, we've got holes. Sometimes monks sewed them up, leaving neat little stitches across the page. Sometimes they wrote right around them, turning an irregular gap into an impromptu border. In one case, a scribe even drew round a hole, turning it into part of an illustration. Waste not, want not. Then there are the translucent bits. Hold up a sheet of parchment to the light, and you'll see the ghost of veins, maybe even faint scar tissue. These weren't flaws, they were just character. You weren't writing on a blank white void like modern paper. You were writing on something that once carried blood. That's the kind of grim poetry monks lived with every day. And while we're here, let's talk about parchment longevity. The reason so many medieval manuscripts survive isn't just because monks prayed over them. It's because parchment lasts. Paper molds, wood warps, papyrus flakes. But a sheep hide, properly treated, will stubbornly sit in a library for 1,000 years. Which means every time you see a medieval book today, you're basically meeting a very well-preserved farm animal in disguise. If sheep had afterlives, half of them are hanging out in the British Library. I could keep pulling on this. Sheep-scented thread for hours, and we will. But let's take a slow turn toward the people behind the work. Because parchment wasn't just technical, it was human. Novices who hated the stink. Experienced craftsmen who could scrape a hide blindfolded. Abbots who calculated how many sheep they'd need for next year's gospel project. And scribes who alternately blessed and cursed the parchment they were given. In short, parchment was the stage. Ink was the actor. Together, they produced centuries of sleepy, holy drama. So, you've got your stretched, scraped, and sanded hide. It's looking respectable now, smooth enough to glide a quill across, and flat enough to stack without curling up like yesterday's bacon. But the job isn't done, not even close, because monks were perfectionists, or, depending on your perspective, obsessive-compulsive with a religious license. Once the hide was declared parchment, the trimming started. This wasn't delicate craft yet. It was practical. Cut off the ragged edges, the tails, the awkward flaps that looked too obviously animal. You don't want your gospel to have a dangling sheep leg corner. Imagine the distraction during morning prayers. Trimming also meant standardizing size. Monks weren't producing 8.5 by 11 sheets, but they liked uniformity. Otherwise, binding later turned into a nightmare. If you've ever tried stacking random notebooks, you get the idea, a mess. So out came the knives again, slicing sheets into consistent rectangles, or as consistent as you could manage without rulers that actually matched. Now, let's talk palimpsests, one of the more desperate yet fascinating quirks of parchment culture. Because parchment was expensive. Remember all those sheep? They didn't grow on trees, so sometimes when monasteries were strapped for cash or simply had too many copies of the wrong text, they'd recycle, which meant scraping old writing off a sheet to make it blank again. The result was called a And here's the kicker. No matter how much you scraped, faint traces of the old writing stuck around, invisible to the naked eye, but lurking. Centuries later, scholars with ultraviolet lamps could read those erased words again, which means the margins of some medieval sermons hide Aristotle, or fragments of lost plays, or forgotten Roman legal codes. It's like peeling paint and finding an older house underneath. Except instead of paint, it's prayers layered over pagan philosophy. For the monk doing the scraping, though it wasn't exciting, it was just labor. Take a manuscript no one wants anymore, rub it raw with pumice, maybe wash it, maybe not, and hope the next text sits neatly on top. Imagine erasing your college essays by sanding your notebook, then reusing the same paper for new homework. A nightmare, but apparently cheaper than killing another calf. And then there's binding. The moment all those sheets became something recognizable as a book. This was another whole production. First, you'd gather sheets into quires, which were little booklets of folded parchment, usually for sheets folded together, which made 8 leaves or 16 pages. Multiply that a few dozen times, and you had a gospel's worth. But parchment doesn't fold like paper. It resists, it bulks. Fold too tightly, and the corners crack. Fold too loosely, and the whole quire flops around like a dead fish. So monks had to coax parchment into shape, then sew it through the fold with thread, stack the quires, and eventually attach them to wooden boards covered in leather. Voila, a book. Except it took months. And here's a charmingly boring detail. Parchment has a hair side and a flesh side. When you open a medieval book, one page might look slightly darker, speckled, with faint hair follicles. That's the hair side. Turn the page, and the next surface looks smoother, whiter. Flesh side. Monks had to plan these page orders so the book alternated hair flesh, rather than bunching them all together. Otherwise, the reader would flip from smooth to patchy in one clump, which offended medieval aesthetics. Yes, people back then cared enough about sheepskin consistency to lose sleep over it, of course. Parchment also had a social afterlife. Old sheets were cut up into book covers, pasted into bindings, or used as scratch paper for accounts. Some scraps showed doodles, trial signatures, or idle sketches. One bored monk famously scribbled, "I am very cold," in the margin of his work, which is possibly the most relatable moment in medieval history. Another quirk, parchment wrinkles in humidity. So monks had to store books carefully, lest the pages curl like lasagna noodles. Some wealthy monasteries built armoria, fancy cupboards for manuscripts. Others just stacked books in wooden chests. Either way, Parchment books were prized, guarded, sometimes even chained to lecterns so they wouldn't wander off with sticky-fingered visitors. And while we're drifting, let's not forget the sheer expense. One estimate suggests that a single large Bible, written on vellum, could cost the modern equivalent of thousands of dollars in animal value alone. Add in the man-hours of preparation, scribes, and illuminators, and you were talking small fortunes, which is why kings and abbots loved showing off their libraries. Owning 50 books in the 12th century was like owning 50 luxury cars today. Except instead of horsepower, you had sheep dash power. So, by the time a monk actually sat down to write on parchment, the skin had lived many lives. From sheep pasture to lime vat, from scraping frame to sanding bench, from trimming knife to sewing table. Each sheet carried that history, even if the final reader never thought about it. Which is why, in a very literal sense, medieval books were layered with boredom and patience. They were built out of hours so dull and smelly that we've mostly forgotten the human cost. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still able to flip through them. The parchment did its job. It endured. Monks probably would not be thrilled to know that their sacred labor is now being narrated in a sleepy, sarcastic YouTube video while someone drifts off to bed. But, honestly, that's a pretty good afterlife for a sheepskin. Better than soup, anyway. Hey guys, if you're still awake, doubtful, but let's pretend. We've finally reached the moment where parchment gets dressed up, because a blank sheepskin is only half the story. To really make it holy, or at least mildly legible, you need ink, which sounds simple. You'd think it's just find some black stuff, rub it with water, done, but of course not. This is the Middle Ages. If there's a long, miserable, overly complicated way to do something, they'll find it. And so we arrive at the great, tedious saga of ink making. Spoiler, it's mostly a story about plants, bugs, and rust, which is probably not what you wanted to hear while cozy in bed, but hey, history isn't glamorous. It's gooey iron Gall ink. The unwanted star-most medieval manuscripts, especially from the 12th century onward, were written with iron Gall ink. You've probably heard of it if you've ever taken a calligraphy class or browsed one of those weird artisanal stationery shops that sells bottled nostalgia. But back in the monastery, it wasn't fancy. It was just what worked. So what is iron Gall ink? It's made from a little unholy trinity of ingredients. Oak galls, those knobby growths you see on oak leaves, caused when tiny wasps inject their eggs into the tree. Yup, every time you see a medieval Bible. Remember, it's basically written in bug spit. Iron salts, usually iron sulfate, which sounds industrial, but back then was just rust scraped off metal, or dug out of mineral deposits. A binder, often gum arabic, a resin from acacia trees, imported through long trade routes, which of course meant it was expensive, rare, and occasionally fake. Mix these together, and you get a deep purplish-black ink that sinks into parchment fibers and stays put for centuries, which is great for preservation. Less great for the monks who had to hunch over it for 8 hours a day, slowly poisoning themselves with iron compounds. But you know, vows of obedience and all that. Collecting galls. The most medieval hobbits zoom in on those oak galls for a minute. Because monks didn't just go to the store and buy a box. They had to collect them, which meant trudging out into oak groves in late summer, poking at leaves and snipping off these ugly little tumor-like knots. Picture a bunch of grown men in robes, scouring trees for bug eggs, muttering prayers, and stuffing lumps into sacks. The neighbors probably thought they'd lost it. The galls had to be dried, crushed, and ground into powder. And since quality varied, monks became picky connoisseurs. Ah, yes, a fine Gall from the hills of southern France. 1348 vintage. Good tannin content. They didn't drink wine, well, most of the time. So this was their version of being snobs. The rusty middle next, up iron salts. Monks got theirs from mineral pyrite or scraped from blacksmith tools. Rust was everywhere in a world where metalwork wasn't stainless, so supply wasn't an issue. What mattered was dissolving it into liquid form. Add the powdered oak galls, stir, and congratulations, you now have a viscous, smelly, staining sludge that will never come out of your robe. This is the part where the modern listener probably thinks, why not just use soot and water? And the answer is, sometimes they did. Carbon inks, made from lampblack or charcoal, existed, but they tended to smudge, rub off, or fade into a sad grey. Iron Gall ink, for all its faults, bit into parchment like a tattoo. Once it was down, it wasn't going anywhere. Unless, of course, it corroded right through the page, which it sometimes did. But we'll save that cheerful disaster for later. Gum Arabic, the pricey glufonally gum Arabic. If the ink was just galls and iron, it would run like bad coffee. Gum thickened it, made it sticky, and let quills hold on to it long enough to actually write. Where did gum Arabic come from? North Africa and the Near East, which meant it traveled on trade routes, passed through the hands of merchants, doubled in price with each stop, and eventually arrived at your poor monastery in a tiny lump. Probably stale, probably adulterated with tree sap that wasn't even acacia, but monks made do. They soaked it, strained it, stirred it in, and ended up with the sticky black ink we now associate with Gothic manuscripts. Testing. 1, 2, 3, once mixed. The ink wasn't ready right away. It had to ferment a bit, thicken, mellow. A good batch could last months. A bad batch, well, that was just another Tuesday. Scribes tested it on scraps of parchment, watching to see if it spread evenly, if it dried fast enough, or if it ate through the page like acid. You think your printer cartridges are temperamental? Try praying that your ink doesn't literally burn holes in your Gospel of Matthew, and if the ink worked, fantastic. Hand it to the scriptorium and let the poor scribes ruin their eyesight with it for the next decade. Now, here's the fun part. No two monasteries ever agreed on a single recipe. Ink wasn't like Coca-Cola with a secret formula. It was more like everyone's grandma making soup. Add a pinch of this, a handful of that. Stir until it looks about right. Hope for the best. Which means when you open a manuscript today, the ink might look black, brown, even purplish. Some turned a warm chestnut as they aged. Others darkened to an almost metallic sheen like a raven's wing. That was considered a mark of quality, unless, of course, it started eating holes through the parchment. Then it was just a mark of bad chemistry. Ink disasters. Yes, Iron Gall ink was notorious for something we now politely call ink corrosion. Basically, the same properties that made it bite into parchment eventually caused it to keep biting. Centuries later, whole pages of manuscripts are riddled with holes exactly where the letters were. You can literally see daylight through the Gospel of John. Imagine putting your life into writing only for it to slowly self-destruct over time. Very medieval, very on-brand. Monks noticed this, of course. Some blamed bad galls. Others blamed lazy novices who didn't stir the vat long enough. One 15th century abbot even scrawled complaints in the margins about Brother Thomas' weak ink. Picture workplace drama, but in brown smudges, colored inks, because black gets boring. Black was the backbone. But monks weren't content to stop there. They loved colored inks for headings, initials, and occasional flair. Red ink, called rubric, came from red ochre or lead compounds. This is where we get the phrase rubric in modern books, the red bits. Of course, the lead wasn't great for long-term health, but neither was monastery gruel. So what's a little poison between friends? Blue inks were even trickier. Some came from crushed Lapis Lazuli, imported at enormous cost from Afghanistan. Others were made from cheaper substitutes like woad or indigo. A scribe dipping his quill into lapis ink was basically holding a month's wages on the tip of his feather. Drop it on the floor, and you'd never live it down. Green inks were usually made from verdigris, essentially copper corrosion scraped off bronze. In other words, medieval monks were happily writing their psalms with toxic goo. It worked, though the pigment tended to eat into parchment even faster than iron gall. Entire illuminated manuscripts today are flaking away because medieval scribes thought a little green would look nice. And of course, there was gold. Real gold, ground into dust, mixed with gum or egg white, and painstakingly applied with a tiny brush. Illuminated manuscript isn't a metaphor. The letters literally glowed. Nothing says humility and poverty vows like slapping powdered treasure onto the page. Weird recipes. Some ink recipes were straightforward. Others, not so much. Surviving medieval manuals include instructions like boil wine with galls until reduced. Add vinegar to keep the ink black. For red, add the blood of a dragonfly. Okay, that last one is probably metaphorical. But who knows? These were the same people who thought putting powdered emeralds in medicine would cure stomach aches. Ink-making manuals also warn against weak ink that turned grey after a year, or thick ink that clotted in the quill. The solution? Boil it again, because when in doubt, throw it back on the fire. Storage nightmares ink wasn't a one-and-done thing. It had to be stored, and this is where things got dicey. If the ink sat too long, it separated. The iron settled, the gum hardened, and suddenly you had a vat of useless sludge. Monks sometimes wrote desperate notes about their ink spoiling like sour milk. Others tried to salvage it with wine, honey, or beer. Yes, beer. Because if you're German and it's the Middle Ages, you fix everything with beer. Spilled ink was the worst nightmare. Imagine months of mixing and fermenting, gone in one clumsy elbow bump. Ink pots were small clay or horn vessels, balanced on the writing desk. One slip, and suddenly you've got the world's first Rorschach test across the Psalms. Margins in some manuscripts even show ink blotches that monks tried, badly, to scrape away. You can almost hear them sighing across the centuries. The eternal testing, every batch of ink needed testing, which meant more parchment scraps wasted. Monks scribbled alphabets, doodled lines, or wrote little phrases like in Numen Domini, just to see if the stuff flowed. These scraps rarely survive, but when they do, they're wonderfully human. You'll see half-formed letters, a random fish sketch, or just the Latin equivalent of blah blah blah. Ink testing was boring, but boring in that way that leaves traces of personality. Quills meet ink. Once the ink was judged good enough, it was finally time to introduce it to quills. But that's another rabbit hole. Goose feathers, carefully hardened, slit with a tiny knife, shaped into nibs, each one lasting maybe a day before wearing down. Imagine sharpening pencils at every hour for decades. And we're not even at the part where the scribes copy words yet. That's still to come. So by the end of all this, oak galls collected, crushed, soaked, mixed with rust and gum, tested, retested, stored, spilled, cursed over, and finally delivered to the scriptorium, you'd think monks would feel relief. Instead, they probably just muttered, well, that only took forever, and then they started again, because ink never lasted as long as the books it created. So, let's say the ink is finally ready. It only took weeks of waiting, endless testing, and maybe one dramatic spill that stained the abbot's sandals forever. Now the real fun begins, writing. Except, fun is not the word. This was a job so repetitive that monks often compared it to penance, which, in a way, it was. Copying scripture was supposed to save your soul, but it could also ruin your eyesight, your spine, and your sanity. The quill, a bird feather with an attitude the tool of choice, was the humble quill. Usually goose, sometimes swan, and if you were really fancy, crow or even peacock. But not chicken. Chicken feathers were considered too soft and frankly a little embarrassing. Imagine walking into the scriptorium with a chicken quill. That's like showing up at the office with crayons instead of pens. Quills weren't just plucked and used. They needed serious prep. First, the feather had to be hardened by soaking it in water, then plunging it into hot sand or ashes. This toughened the shaft so it didn't bend like a wet noodle while writing. Then came the delicate business of cutting the nib. Monks used a penknife. Yes, that's where the word comes from. They sliced the tip at just the right angle, split it down the middle for ink flow, and shaped the edges for the perfect line. A badly cut quill meant blotchy letters, wasted parchment, and a very cranky abbot breathing down your neck. And here's the kicker. One quill might only last a single day, sometimes only a few hours. Writing on animal skin wasn't gentle on the nib, so scribes constantly sharpened and recut their quills. Imagine sharpening a pencil every 10 sentences. Except the pencil is a dead bird feather you've been boiling in sand. The desk set up the scriptorium itself was about as cheerful as a dentist's waiting room. Rows of desks, each with a slanted writing surface to keep the parchment from sliding off. A little ink pot wedged into a corner. Quills lined up like surgical tools. And usually, no heat in winter. Parchment stiffens in the cold, ink thickens, and fingers go numb. Perfect conditions for elegant handwriting. Some monasteries allowed scribes a little cushion or stool. Others expected them to stand, hours on end, hunched over, squinting at cramped letters. One chronicler described it as a martyrdom of the eyes, which feels dramatic. But if you've ever stared at Times New Roman 12 for 10 hours straight, you get it. Writing rules. Copying wasn't a free. Every letter had to look the same. Uniform script meant uniform holiness. A single sloppy A could ruin a whole line. Scribes were trained to measure out lines with a stylus before writing, pressing faint grooves into the parchment to keep rows straight. If you flip some medieval manuscripts sideways today, you can still see the ghostly lines scratched in the background. It's like medieval graph paper. Errors were inevitable though. You're copying thousands of words by hand with no CTRL plus C. When mistakes happened, there were two choices: scrape the parchment with a knife to erase the letter and write again, If that didn't work, add a note in the margin with a tiny arrow pointing back to the spot. This is why so many medieval manuscripts have those quirky little marginal doodles. Some are corrections. Others are monks entertaining themselves while stuck on page 312 of Leviticus. The boring repetition we have to remember. Much of what they copied was not thrilling. Yes, there were illuminated Bibles, but there were also endless homilies, legal charters, theological treatises with names like On the Proper Arrangement of Psalms During Lent. Imagine spending a week writing out instructions for how many times to stand up and sit down during Easter services. Thrilling bedtime material. One poor monk left a note at the end of his manuscript that basically reads, "Writing is a great labor. Whoever does not know it cannot imagine it. May God grant mercy to the soul of the scribe." Another just wrote bluntly, "Thank God it will soon be dark." Quill plus ink equals problems, of course. The quill and ink relationship wasn't always smooth. Ink might be too thin and run down the page, or too thick and clog the nib. Sometimes the quill picked up a bit of parchment fuzz, turning every stroke into a smudge. Scribes had to pause constantly to trim quills, stir ink, or mutter unholy things under their breath. A few manuscripts even contain accidental blots shaped suspiciously like someone sneezed mid-sentence, and then there's the smudging. Rest your hand too close, and half the psalm turns into a grey smear. Left-handed scribes. Forget it. They were basically doomed unless they mastered some kind of awkward wrist hover. The slow, grind copying one manuscript could take months. A single Bible. Years. Even with teams of monks working in parallel, progress was glacial. This is why books were insanely valuable. Owning a single gospel could be the equivalent of owning a small house, which explains why monks treated their quills and ink like holy relics. Drop one, and it wasn't just a workplace accident. It was practically a crime. So by the time the quill scratched out the last line, the ink dried and the monk stretched his cramping fingers. He wasn't just producing a book. He was producing a lifelong backache, a few ink stains, and a note in the margin that said, "Whoever reads this, remember me." Marginalia, the Boredom Chronicles monks, were human. Even holy men with vows of silence got restless after writing the same psalms for hours. So, naturally, they started decorating the margins. And not just fancy swirls or illuminations. No, some scribes had a taste for, well, chaos. You might see tiny stick figures wrestling, snails inexplicably fighting knights, monkeys playing musical instruments. Why? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe a visual break from the monotony. Maybe subtle commentary on the absurdity of their work. One theory is that these doodles helped scribes keep their hands limber. Another theory is that boredom and insomnia drive people to draw snails with swords. Either way, it's strangely comforting to know even in the 12th century, someone was doodling in the margins instead of doing their job. Scribal pranks and insults sometimes. Monks got creative in ways that were far less innocent. Scribes occasionally used the margins to leave messages for future readers, or fellow scribes veiled insults, complaints, or sarcastic commentary. Example, a monk might write, "Brother John thinks he writes better than he does. Let him try finishing this quire without dropping ink on the text." Or, more cryptically, "Here lies the error of Brother Thomas. Pray he repents." These little notes show a side of monastic life rarely discussed in textbooks. Passive-aggressive medieval office politics, ink-fueled petty revenge, preserved forever on animal hide. You can almost imagine monks rolling their eyes at each other while the abbot wasn't looking, whispering, "Yes, very holy, Brother Simon, but your handwriting is atrocious." Doodles as therapists and scribes use doodles to cope with repetitive strain. A hand cramped from hours of writing needed some mental diversion, so a dragon might appear in the corner, or a tiny pilgrim sneaks down the margin carrying a scroll. Over decades, this evolved into full-fledged marginal art. Rabbits jousting, grotesque hybrid creatures, and occasionally erotic images, though these were rarer and presumably meant for private amusement. All of this was harmless enough, but it tells us that even the most disciplined monks sought small escapes from monotony. And, for us, centuries later, it's a gentle window into their tired, slightly mischievous minds. Lettering and script perfection beyond the margins. The writing itself was a craft of endless repetition. Each letter had strict proportions. Gothic script demanded straight verticals, precise loops, and uniform spacing. Deviate even slightly, and you were, according to monastic standards, a failure of God's grace. Yet some monks got inventive, elongating letters to fill gaps, or decorating ascenders with subtle flourishes. These tiny embellishments were carefully controlled, just enough to personalize a page, but not enough to offend the abbot. The goal was consistency, but within that rigid structure, scribes found room for creativity. Ink, mishap squills, and ink conspired against monks constantly. A sudden blot could destroy half a line. Wet ink smudged when a finger brushed the page. Occasionally, a quill would splinter, leaving scratches that looked like microscopic roadmaps. Scribes adapted, scraping or patching with tiny pieces of parchment, sometimes literally sewing a patch into the page. Even these mistakes became part of the charm. Centuries later, scholars can trace a scribe's day by the sequence of errors, corrections, and doodles. In a way, the manuscript becomes a diary of tedium, a testament to slow labor and patient repetition. Teamwork in the scriptoriums. Some manuscripts were copied by multiple scribes simultaneously. One monk would tackle text, another would add decorative initials, and another might illuminate or add color. Coordination was key, otherwise you'd end up with mismatched letters, crooked margins, or scribbled notes where a capital letter should have been. Imagine a team project today where everyone insists on using their own font and decides that one page should be blue while the next is bright red. Now replace computers with dead animal skins and quills. That was medieval teamwork. The meditation of repetition, finally. It's worth noting that this process, slow and tedious as it was, had its own rhythm. Monks often described writing as meditative. Line after line, letter after letter, punctuated by careful breathing and quiet prayers. Boredom here wasn't just an obstacle. It was part of the spiritual exercise. By repeating the same words over and over, a monk could contemplate their meaning, their faith, and the minutiae of their craft. Even modern readers can sense this rhythm. You hold a manuscript and feel the weight of slow, repetitive labor. The pages are smooth, the ink slightly raised, the margins dotted with human whims and tiny protests. It's a world built for patience, subtlety, and yes, sleep. Hey everyone, welcome back to the quiet, slow crawl of medieval bookmaking. By now, you've followed a sheet of parchment from sheep pasture to stretched hide, seen ink brewed from bug guts and rust, and sat alongside a monk as he painstakingly copied lines of psalms. And yet, the story isn't complete. Because somewhere along the way, someone decided that books should sparkle. Yes, sparkle, with gold and blue, and sometimes tiny, inexplicable snails. The birth of illumination in manuscripts isn't just pretty decoration. It's slow, painstaking, and slightly absurd. A monk might take months to finish a single initial letter on a page, mixing pigments, grinding minerals, and applying gold leaf. Sometimes they added subtle touches in the margins, a rabbit jousting, a cat playing a lute, or a snail wearing armor. Why snails? Who knows? But they became a recurring theme. Perhaps the monks had a secret sense of humor, or maybe snails were metaphors for patience, which would be fitting given how long they spent making the books. Pigments and ingredients colors were not bought at a store. They were mined, scraped, or extracted with laborious care. Ultramarine blue came from Lapis Lazuli, imported from Afghanistan. It was more expensive than gold. Literally, a single blue initial could cost more than an entire goat herd. Red inks and paints, often used cinnabar or vermilion or crushed red ochre. Sometimes saffron was used for yellow-orange shades. Green pigments were usually verdigris, the result of corroded copper, pleasant to look at, poisonous to handle. Mixing these pigments into a usable paint took skill. A binder such as egg white or gum arabic was added to make it stick to parchment. Too much binder and the color would flake off. Too little and it would smear. One misstep and a glowing gold initial could look like a muddy leaf. Sticky mess, gold leaf, and burnishing gold was the ultimate flourish. Monks pounded it into thin sheets, sometimes thinner than a hair, and applied it to initials or borders. This process was slow and exacting. First, a sticky base was painted onto the page. Then the gold was laid over carefully. Finally, it was burnished, polished, until it gleamed in candlelight. Some monks became famous for their skill with gold leaf. Others just cursed under their breath as tiny gold flakes drifted onto their robes, the floor, or a friend's manuscript. There's a surviving note from one scriptorium complaining about the cost of gold and the mess it made. Even in the Middle Ages, office cleanup was a problem. Layering and drying unlike modern paint. Medieval pigments took time to dry. Colors were applied in layers. A red border might need 3 or 4 coats, each carefully dried. Blue backgrounds often required multiple passes to achieve the rich, velvety depth monks wanted. You couldn't rush this. Patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival mechanism. Marginal flourishes illuminations often extended beyond the main text. Margins became playgrounds for small sketches. Some were symbolic, dragons for evil, snails for patience, tiny birds for the soul. Others were whimsical, a bishop fighting a chicken, a knight riding a snail, or a monk sneezing and knocking over his inkpot. These illustrations weren't considered errors, they were personality, a little human trace in a painstakingly uniform world. And centuries later, when we look at these margins, we see humor, boredom, and imagination lurking quietly in every page. The ritual of color-applying pigments was almost ritualistic. Monks mixed powders, tested colors on scrap parchment, and carefully planned their layout. Mistakes were costly. You can't scrape off gold or ultramarine like you can graphite. A stray brushstroke could ruin a page, sometimes requiring a complete redo. Some monasteries had workshops dedicated solely to illumination. Scribes and illuminators might collaborate, but often they worked in isolation, each contributing to a massive project that could take years to complete. The end result? A manuscript that was not just text, but a visual meditation, a layered object of devotion, patience, and frankly, boredom-induced creativity. The humor hidden in beauty then, in the most solemn manuscripts. Monks couldn't resist tiny jokes. For example, a rabbit wielding a sword in the margin, a man riding a hybrid creature with a bird's head, a knight chasing a snail for no apparent reason. These small, inconsequential flourishes remind us that monks were human, prone to boredom, and amused by the absurdity of their repetitive labor. It's a comfort to know that even in a life of chanting and copying holy texts, someone was quietly sketching a snail knight just to pass the time. A slow, sparkling conclusion, so, by the end of illumination, we see a page layered with centuries of effort, animal skins stretched, scraped and dried, ink brewed from rust, bug galls and gum dot letters copied meticulously with a temperamental quill, gold and pigments painstakingly applied, layer by layer, marginalia offering humor, protest, or tiny rebellions. Every page becomes a quiet testament to patience, repetition, and the slightly absurd human desire to decorate even the most tedious labor. The result isn't just a manuscript. It's a meditation, a record, and a sleepy window into the mind of a monk. Pigment sourcing. A worldly problem. Pigments were not local or easy to obtain. They traveled across countries and continents. Ultramarine came from Afghanistan. Vermilion often came from Spain or the Middle East. Gold, well, gold might have been local or imported from further afield, depending on wealth and access. Monks often had to ration pigments carefully, because one careless smear could waste weeks of expensive materials. There were stories of scribes sneaking tiny amounts of pigment home, which was considered a minor theft, but also understandable. After all, a small jar of Lapis Lazuli could be worth more than a sheep. And when you're staring at the same psalms for months, a little temptation is inevitable. Grinding, mixing, and layering pigments weren't just used straight out of the bag. They needed to be ground into an extremely fine powder. This was done on a stone slab with a mortar and pestle. Some powders took hours to achieve the right consistency. Too coarse, and the color would look grainy. Too fine, and it would be unstable and flake off. Once the powder was ready, it had to be mixed with a binder, egg white, gum arabic, or sometimes fish glue. Too much binder and the pigment spread poorly. Too little and it wouldn't stick at all. Then came testing. A tiny drop was applied to a scrap of parchment, dried, inspected, and often discarded if it didn't meet standards. Layering colors was another slow, meticulous process. A blue background often required 3 or 4 thin washes to achieve the desired depth, letting each layer dry completely before adding the next. Gold leaf, for example, was applied after base colors dried, then polished carefully to shine. One false move, and you could wrinkle the gold, tear the parchment, or smudge surrounding pigments. Gold leaf mishaps. Gold leaf mishaps. Gold leaf was both glamorous and maddening. It was so thin that even the gentlest touch could tear it. Monks had to apply it with extreme care using special brushes, sometimes burnishing it with a tiny piece of polished stone or bone. Problems were frequent. A stray gust of wind might lift a sheet of gold mid-application. Moisture in the air could cause it to stick to the wrong spot. Overzealous burnishing could leave permanent grooves in the parchment. And yet, monks persevered, because gold leaf wasn't just decoration. It was symbolic. It reflected divine light, indicated importance, and showed off the monastery's wealth. The spiritual and social stakes were high enough to justify the painstaking labor. Marginalia extended. More snails and rabbitses. The illuminator toiled. Boredom crept in. Margins became playgrounds. Some of the most enduring motifs were snails, often in battles with knights, possibly as metaphors for slow progress or just sheer silliness. Hybrid creatures, half bird, half human, half cat. Why? Because why not? Everyday life sketches, monks cooking, cleaning, or sneezing into ink pots. These illustrations weren't strictly required, but they made the repetitive work tolerable. They also allowed scribes to leave a subtle fingerprint of personality in otherwise uniform manuscripts. Rituals of illumination, the act of illumination, was itself ritualized. Monks often started by planning a page in advance, sketching the layout lightly in lead or silver point, applying base colors, letting each layer dry completely, adding details like borders, faces, or symbolic elements, applying gold leaf and burnishing carefully. All of this had to happen under steady lighting, often candlelight in winter. One flicker and a shadow could distort the brushstroke, ruining hours of work. Some monasteries even installed small windows or light reflectors to maximize illumination during the day. Frustrations and patience sieve on with perfect technique. Problems were endless. Pigments ran or faded unevenly. Gold leaf flaked. Quills dragged through wet paint, leaving scratches. Temperatures and humidity affected drying times. Monks wrote bitter notes in their manuals and margins. Do not attempt this on a damp day, lest all be ruined, or patience, patience, patience. Centuries later, we can read these as whispers of exhaustion from their painstaking craft. The subtle humidist by all the tedium. Humor remained. A small snail chasing a knight might be placed next to a particularly tricky verse, or a tiny rabbit might peer at a gold initial as if judging the monk's work. These minor flourishes, invisible at first glance, gave the manuscript's character and a sense of playfulness. It's comforting to remember. Even the most devout scribes needed tiny escapes, little moments of levity amidst the monotony of holy labor. And these tiny jokes have survived, frozen on parchment, quietly waiting for modern readers to smile and yawn simultaneously. By the end of the illumination process, a single page was a product of weeks of labor, meticulous planning, careful layering, pigment testing, gold leaf application, and boredom-fueled creativity. Each manuscript became a meditative object, a record of patience, ritual, and the slow, repetitive devotion of monks. Hey everyone, welcome back. By now, you've followed a sheet of parchment from sheep pasture to stretched hide, seen ink brewed from bug guts and rust, watched scribes painstakingly copy text with quills, and marveled at the painstaking illuminations with gold snails and tiny rabbits in the margins. But all of that effort is meaningless if the finished book can't survive a few decades. And that, friends, is where manuscript preservation begins. Binding, holding it all together. Once a manuscript was complete, it wasn't just a stack of parchment. It had to be bound into a book. Binding in the Middle Ages was laborious and precise. Gathering quires. Individual sheets of parchment were folded into gatherings called quires. usually 4 to 8 sheets. Each quire had to be aligned perfectly. One crooked fold and the book would never sit right on a shelf. Sewing quires were sewn together with linen or hemp thread, often by hand. Monks carefully stitched along cords or thongs to ensure the gatherings stayed tight. One skipped stitch could mean a quire slipping free, and with hundreds of pages, that was a disaster waiting to happen. Covers, wooden boards were attached as covers, sometimes covered in leather and occasionally reinforced with metal corners. The weight of these covers helped keep the parchment flat, but added another level of complexity. The binding had to be strong, yet flexible enough to open the book fully. The roll of leather and rope's leather was the preferred cover material. Thick, durable, and slightly pliable, it protected the manuscript from moisture, dust, and curious rodents. Some manuscripts even had clasped covers, small metal clasps that kept the book tightly shut, preventing pages from warping in damp monastic cellars. Ropes, cords, and ties were also used in larger libraries. A manuscript might be secured to a shelf or chained to prevent theft. Yes, monasteries had chained libraries. You could borrow the book, but not walk off with it. Imagine having a copy of the Psalms you can read only while tethered to a desk. Storage. Challenges monks faced many challenges in storing manuscripts. Humidity. Too much moisture would warp parchment and ruin pigments. Pests, mice, insects, and even curious birds could gnaw on bindings or nibble. Pages, temperature, fluctuations could cause parchment to expand and contract, leading to cracking ink or loose quires. To mitigate these, manuscripts were stored carefully in wooden cupboards, shelves, or closets called armoria. Some libraries had special elevated platforms to keep books off the damp stone floors. Others kept manuscripts wrapped in linen or stored in boxes. Handling rituals, monks didn't just toss manuscripts onto a shelf. Handling was ritualistic. Hands were washed before touching pages to avoid oils damaging the ink. Books were opened slowly, supporting the spine and preventing stress on the binding. Sometimes, manuscripts were read only with a wooden pointer to avoid touching delicate text or illuminations. Even after years, these rituals helped manuscripts survive. When we open medieval books today, we can still see the faint fingerprints and careful wear patterns left by centuries of careful use, repairs, and maintenance. Despite all precautions, manuscripts needed occasional maintenance. Ink could flake, parchment tear, and bindings loosen. Monks were sometimes called in just to repair books. Loose quires were resewn, tears patched with small pieces of parchment ink, touch-ups for faded letters, gold leaf sometimes reapplied or burnished in some cases. The repairs themselves became part of the manuscript's history. Margins might contain notes. Brother Henry repaired this page in the year 13-4. Future generations could track the life of the book as a living object, not just a static artifact. Cataloging and access in larger monasteries. Libraries began cataloging manuscripts, often by subject or importance. Shelves might be numbered, and lists kept in separate registers. Sometimes, books were chained to desks, sometimes left loose. Borrowing protocols were strict. Scribes or monks could check out a manuscript only with permission, sometimes noting in a ledger when it was returned. This level of organization was essential for ensuring that centuries of labor, ink, quills, illuminations, and binding weren't lost to chaos or carelessness. The quiet art of preservation at the heart of manuscript storage was patience and foresight. Every decision, how to store, how to handle, how to repair, was meant to extend the life of the book for decades, sometimes centuries. It's a testament to the monks' quiet dedication that so many medieval manuscripts survive today. Despite tedium, frustration, and boredom, they created objects of extraordinary longevity. Books that began as sheep hides and bug-all ink still survive in libraries around the world, quietly holding centuries of history, craftsmanship, and human habit by now. You can picture a finished manuscript, parchment stretched and inked, letters meticulously copied, illuminations shining with gold and vibrant pigments. But all of that effort was useless if the book fell apart. So monks developed detailed techniques to store, repair, and maintain their precious creations. Bindings weren't uniform, depending on the monastery's wealth, region, or resources. Books could have very different construction. Single board covers, one wooden board for the front and back, often covered with leather or decorated with metal studs. Simple but functional. Double board bindings, two sturdy wooden boards, sometimes reinforced with corner plates, central bosses, or clasps. These were more durable, especially for large Bibles or collections of psalms. Flexible bindings, some manuscripts had thinner boards and leather, allowing easier opening and handling for frequently used texts. Monks carefully matched the binding to the manuscript's size, weight, and use. A large, heavily illuminated Bible required massive boards and reinforced spine cords. A small prayer book might get a simple leather wrap. Each decision balanced durability, accessibility, and cost. Repairs, a lifelong task even with careful storage. Manuscripts suffered wear over time. Monks became amateur conservators, skilled in repairing parchment, rebinding quires, and restoring faded pigments, parchment tears. Small rips could be patched with thin slips of new parchment, glued or sewn over the damaged area. Loose quires, sometimes entire gatherings, came undone. Monks would resew them into the binding using fine linen or hemp thread. Ink touch-ups. Faded or flaked letters could be reinforced with fresh ink. Sometimes entire initials were redrawn, especially in illuminated sections. Gold leaf restoration, if burnished gold flaked. Tiny pieces could be carefully reapplied. Occasionally, monks would leave notes recording these interventions. Brother Gerard mended this leaf. Year of our Lord, 1372. These tiny annotations offer modern historians a glimpse into the manuscript's long life and ongoing care. Handling rituals in practice, monks didn't just store manuscripts carefully. They interacted with them ritualistically, hand-washing. Clean hands minimized oils and dirt on parchment. Supportive surfaces. Manuscripts were opened on slanted desks or cushioned pillows to avoid strain on the spine and binding, using pointers. Some monks used wooden or bone pointers to follow lines, especially when reading sacred texts, preventing smudging or accidental page damage. Even small acts, like avoiding resting elbows on the pages or carefully lifting covers, contributed to centuries-long preservation. Each movement was deliberate, slow, and deliberate again. Chained libraries and security in larger monasteries. Manuscripts were sometimes chained to shelves or desks. The chains were long enough to allow reading at a desk, but short enough to prevent theft. This might seem restrictive, but it protected books of extraordinary value. Rare Bibles, illuminated prayer books, or treatises on theology and law. These chained libraries often had strict protocols. Only authorized monks could access certain manuscripts. Books might be requested in advance and logged in a registry. Special reading rooms prevented damage from sunlight, moisture, or careless handling. This careful system ensured the survival of rare texts for centuries, even before modern libraries or climate control existed. Environmental considerations. Monks were keenly aware of how temperature, humidity, and light affected manuscripts. Stone monasteries could be cold in winter and damp in summer. Elevated shelves or platforms kept books away from wet floors. Humidity, parchment expands and contracts with moisture. Too damp, and pages warped or mold developed. Too dry, and pages became brittle. Monks stored manuscripts in controlled locations whenever possible. Light, sunlight could fade pigments, especially reds and blues. Shelves and cupboards were placed to minimize exposure. Even simple practices, like closing windows during storms or keeping candles at a safe distance, were part of long-term preservation, cataloging, and organization in monasteries with larger collections. Cataloging became essential. Monks recorded manuscripts in ledgers or lists, sometimes noting title or subject author or scribe date, of completion location on the shelf or in a cupboard. Some libraries even implemented rudimentary numbering systems. This careful organization prevented books from being lost, misplaced, or damaged through overhandling. The quiet art of patience of this binding, handling, repairs, cataloging, environmental care speaks to a meditative patience. Monks dedicated their lives not only to creating books, but to ensuring they survived. Every quill, stroke, pigment mix, and gold application was only part of the process. The rest was stewardship. We can still feel that patience when we open a surviving manuscript today. The slightly raised letters, the polished gold, the faint indentations from centuries of careful turning. Each book is a record of labor, ritual, boredom, and devotion. Candlelight and manuscript safety monks often worked and read by candlelight, especially in winter months when daylight was scarce. Candles were essential, but also a constant source of anxiety. Fire risk, open flames could easily singe pages, parchments, or bindings. One careless gust of wind could turn hours of labor into ash-wax drips. Even careful candle placement couldn't prevent occasional drips, which could harden and ruin pigment or gold leaf. Lighting rituals. Monks often positioned candles at specific angles to reduce shadows and glare, ensuring accurate reading and writing without smudging. In some libraries, special iron holders or sconces were installed to stabilize candles and keep them at a safe distance from manuscripts. Every small adjustment was a careful, slow ritual. Dusting and cleaning dust was another persistent enemy. Stone monasteries were dusty, and manuscripts could easily collect fine particles that abrade parchment or dull pigments. Routine dusting. Monks used soft brushes to gently sweep dust off pages and bindings. The brushes were often made of soft animal hair to avoid scratching delicate illuminations. Air circulation. Some libraries used elevated shelves and window shutters to manage airflow, reducing dust accumulation. Cushioning. Important books were sometimes stored between layers of cloth or linen, creating a protective barrier against dust, moisture, and pests. Even dusting was deliberate and slow. A meditative part of manuscript stewardship. Emergency repairs. Despite careful storage, accidents happened. Monks were prepared with a variety of repair techniques, rebinding damaged books, Broken spines or torn covers were reinforced with additional leather strips or even small wooden splints. Parchment replacement. When a page was beyond repair, a monk might excise it and insert a new, carefully prepared sheet. This required precise alignment and sewing reappling pigments or gold. Faded illustrations could be touched up, often requiring hours of delicate work to match the original color. Sometimes these repairs included notes in the margins. Brother Conrad fixed this page in the year of our Lord, 1453. May it last longer than I have. These annotations provide modern readers with small windows into the repetitive, careful life of a manuscript conservator. Pest control rodents and insects were constant threats. Mice, known for nibbling bindings and parchment edges. Monks often kept cats nearby, though not always. Insects, certain beetles and larvae could burrow into parchment or leather. Some monasteries used herbs like lavender or rosemary to deter them. Preventative storage. Books were elevated, sometimes wrapped in cloth, and kept in tightly closed cupboards. Even with these measures, a manuscript could still fall victim to nature's little hazards. Careful monitoring and routine inspection were essential. Environmental awareness monks were keenly aware of how temperature, timidity, and light affected manuscripts. Temperature, sudden changes could warp parchment, loosen bindings, or crack pigments. Humidity, damp conditions promoted mold growth. Overly dry conditions made parchment brittle. Monks often adjusted storage locations seasonally, moving books to cooler or drier parts of the scriptorium. Sunlight faded pigments, so shelves were carefully positioned. Windows sometimes had shutters or curtains to regulate exposure. Even small factors, like closing a door during a storm or moving a manuscript away from a sunlit window, were crucial for long-term preservation. Ritualized handling monks approached manuscripts with a combination of respect, superstition, and habit. Washing hands. Oils and dirt could degrade ink and pigments. Support. Books were opened on slanted desks or cushioned surfaces to avoid stressing the spine. Pointers, wooden or bone pointers, allowed reading without touching the text. Turning pages carefully. Each leaf was lifted slowly, one at a time, to prevent tearing. Handling manuscripts was less a practical necessity and more a mindful, meditative ritual. A combination of reverence and tedious attention to detail. Cataloging and monasteries, with large collections, implemented cataloging systems, registers, ledgers, listed books by subject, author or importance, chained libraries. Manuscripts were chained to prevent theft. Readers could consult them at a desk but not remove them. Restricted access. Only certain monks could handle particular books, especially rare or illuminated manuscripts. This level of organization ensured centuries of labor. Quills, ink, illuminations, and careful handling were not lost to misplacement or accidents. By now, you've followed a manuscript from stretched sheep hide to carefully illuminated page. Watched monks brew ink, add gold leaf, and store their creations with painstaking care. But all of that labor occurred within a daily rhythm that was slow, repetitive, and carefully controlled. Today, we're going to drift through a typical day in a medieval scriptorium, observing the quiet, almost hypnotic routines that filled each monk's hours. Dawn, rising and preparing monks began their day very early, often before sunrise. The first tasks weren't ink or quills, but personal and spiritual preparation. washing and dressing. Monks cleaned themselves in cold water, donned their habits, and ensured they were ready for the day's work. Prayer and chanting before touching manuscripts. They often attended matins or lauds, the early morning prayers. This spiritual exercise was meant to center the mind and instill focus. Simple breakfast, a piece of bread, maybe some cheese or porridge, often eaten in silence. Silence was not just decorum. It preserved a calm atmosphere conducive to careful work by the time the sun rose. Monks were ready to enter the scriptorium, a space that combined work, devotion, and discipline morning work. Copying text the morning was often devoted to copying manuscripts. Tasks included setting up parchment and ink. Parchment sheets were laid out, quills sharpened, and ink tested for consistency. Writing, monks copied texts slowly, line by line, letter by letter. Accuracy was paramount. Even a single mistake could require scraping the ink off with a knife or starting the page over dot collaboration. In larger scriptoria, monks sometimes worked side by side. One monk might handle text, another initial letters, another illuminations. Coordination was slow and careful, ensuring uniformity. The morning hours were repetitive, meditative, and occasionally punctuated by minor frustrations, an inkpot tipping, a quill splintering, or parchment shifting. These moments were accepted as part of the rhythm of work. Midday break. Reflection and rest. Monks usually paused around midday for a short break. Silent reflection or prayer, a moment to recalibrate focus. Simple meal, often bread, legumes, and occasionally fish or cheese. Meals were quiet and slow, reinforcing a sense of calm and discipline. Stretching or walking. Some monasteries allowed brief walks in cloisters to ease stiff muscles, especially fingers and wrists from long hours of writing. Even these breaks were unhurried, a deliberate pause to maintain both physical and mental stamina. Afternoon, illumination and decoration. Afternoon often focused on illumination and decoration, applying pigments and gold leaf. Monks carefully layered colors, polished gold, and added marginalia. Each step required precision, patience, and slow, methodical movements. Testing colors. Pigments were tested on scrap parchment to ensure vibrancy and stability. Layering details, borders, initials, and small illustrations were added, one layer at a time, letting each dry completely before proceeding. This work could take hours, sometimes days, on a single page. The pace was intentionally slow, almost hypnotic, and designed to cultivate patience and devotion. Evening, preservation, and cleanup as the day wound down. Monks turned to manuscript care and scriptorium maintenance, inspecting manuscripts, checking for damage, smudges, or loose quires. Cleaning workspaces, brushes and quills were cleaned, ink pots sealed, and surfaces dusted. Storage, completed manuscripts were returned to cupboards, shelves, or chained libraries. Special attention was paid to alignment, cover placement, and environmental conditions. Even mundane tasks like dusting or wiping gold leaf edges were performed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, reinforcing the scriptorium's quiet, meditative atmosphere. Night, prayer, and reflection. The day concluded with vespers and compline. The evening prayers, chanting, and silent meditation. A final spiritual exercise to reflect on the day's labor. Planning for tomorrow. Monks might make notes on pages to continue copying or illuminating the next day, retiring to cells, quietly resting, often in stone rooms. With manuscripts stored safely nearby, sleep was necessary, but often interrupted by ritual bells or the sound of wind and stone walls. The cycle would begin again the next day, slow, repetitive, and unwavering. The meditative rhythm what emerges from this daily schedule is a pattern of repetition, care, and mindfulness. Every step, from dawn prayers to dusting manuscripts at night, reinforced a lifestyle of slow, attentive labor. Mistakes were corrected carefully. Pigments, quills, and gold leaf were handled deliberately. Books were stored meticulously. This rhythm, while tedious, created a steady, almost hypnotic pace that suited the slow, careful work of manuscript production. Modern readers can almost feel the weight of a parchment under their fingers and the subtle scratching of quills, the faint gleam of gold in candlelight, and the quiet sighs of monks deep in concentration. Hey everyone, welcome back. By now, you've seen how manuscripts were created, illuminated, bound, and carefully preserved. But there's another layer to this slow, sleepy world, the small, often peculiar habits that monks developed to survive their repetitive workdays. These rituals were subtle, almost invisible, but they added structure, amusement, and a touch of humanity to the otherwise painstaking routines. Quill sharpening. A meditative art sharpening quills was more than a necessity, was almost a ritualistic practice. Choosing the right feather, goose, swan, or crow feathers were carefully selected for stiffness and flexibility. Some monks even preferred older, slightly brittle feathers because they produced a sharper line. Cutting the nib using a penknife. The tip was shaped precisely, often tested on scrap parchment, to narrow and ink wouldn't flow. Too wide, and letters would blob, polishing and trimming. A small file or sandpaper-like tool was sometimes used to smooth the nib. Monks often sharpened multiple quills at once, turning the process into a repetitive, almost hypnotic exercise. The rhythm of cutting, testing, and trimming became part of the scriptorium's gentle background hum. Ink testing, games, before applying ink to a page. Monks tested it on scrap parchment. Sometimes this became a quiet, playful ritual, scribbling letters or doodles to judge flow and color, practicing decorative flourishes, tiny animals or abstract patterns, subtle competitions. Who could draw the straightest line or the most elegant swirl? These tiny games broke up monotony and allowed brief moments of amusement in an otherwise serious environment. Candlelight. Adjustments lighting manuscripts was an exacting task. Positioning candles, adjusting the flame so shadows didn't interfere with lines or illuminations. Multiple candles. Larger projects sometimes required more than one candle, carefully spaced to avoid uneven illumination. Wax drips. A tiny ritual of trimming or catching drips prevented damage to pages. Some monks even timed work by the length of candle burn, adding a subtle sense of pacing to the day. Doodle margins. Boredom meets creativity when repetition became tedious. Monks sometimes added small sketches to the margins. Even in the middle of serious religious texts, rabbits jousting or hunting, tiny snails marching along borders, odd hybrid creatures, bird-headed men, fish-limbed animals, or miniature monks sneezing into ink pots. These doodles were rarely recorded officially but left traces of personality, humor, and tiny rebellion within the strict regulated scriptorium, environment, physical posture, and finger. Exercises long hours hunched over manuscripts required careful attention to posture, elbows propped on cushions, wrists aligned, and back slightly bent to avoid strain. Finger stretches between quill strokes to prevent cramps. Occasional walks in cloisters to relieve stiff muscles. These slow, deliberate movements became habits, quietly interwoven into the day. They weren't exciting, but were essential for sustaining months or years of repetitive labor. Whispered notes and silent communicational, though silence dominated scriptorium work. Some tiny communication rituals emerged. Notes left on scrap parchment to explain corrections or unfinished sections. Silent gestures to neighboring monks, nods, hand signals, or subtle eye contact. Occasionally, a small joke drawn in the margins as a way to share humor without speaking. These practices maintained a quiet camaraderie while keeping the scriptorium focused and orderly. Environmental awareness as minor changes in the scriptorium demanded subtle rituals, adjusting shutters to control sunlight or draft, rotating manuscripts to avoid uneven fading, checking humidity by touch or sight to prevent parchment warping. Every movement was measured. Slow and deliberate, part habit, part survival strategy. The tiny rewards of patience, these small rituals, sharpening quills, doodling margins, testing pigments, adjusting candlelight had one effect. They made the monotony tolerable. They created tiny pockets of control, amusement, and mindfulness within the otherwise slow and repetitive workflow of manuscript production. Even centuries later, we can sense the rhythm, the scratching quill, the faint gleam of gold, the soft flicker of candlelight, the quiet scribbles in margins. Each manuscript wasn't just text. It was a living record of patient hands, small rituals, and the human need to find order, creativity, and tiny joy in tedious labor. By now, we've followed manuscripts from their creation through illumination, binding, storage, and the tiny rituals that monks developed to survive long hours in the scriptorium. But books didn't always stay in one place. They traveled sometimes between monasteries, occasionally across kingdoms, and very rarely across Europe. And because they were fragile, each journey required patience, care, and a fair bit of superstition. The reasons manuscripts traveled manuscripts weren't just for show. They were functional, valuable objects, loans between monasteries. Smaller or poorer monasteries often borrowed texts from larger, wealthier ones. They were usually carefully logged and expected to return. Royal requests. Kings or queens might commission copies of important works, or borrow illuminated Bibles, theological texts, or historical records, scholar exchanges. Universities and early schools sometimes requested manuscripts for study or reference. Every journey increased the risk of damage, so monks took extensive precautions, preparing a manuscript for travel before leaving its shelf. A manuscript required preparation, wrapping. Manuscripts were often wrapped in linen or cloth to protect parchment, bindings, and illuminations from dust, moisture, or accidental rubbing. Cushioning. Sometimes they were placed between soft boards, pillows, or straw in wooden chests. The goal was to absorb shocks and vibrations during travel. Sealing. Important manuscripts were sometimes sealed with wax to indicate ownership or authenticity. Monks occasionally added notes on provenance or care instructions. Preparation alone could take hours. reflecting the same patience and care used in creation. Modes of transport methods were slow and careful, much like the manuscripts themselves, by foot or horse. Couriers carried manuscripts in specially designed chests or satchels, often padded to prevent jostling by cart. Wooden wagons offered space for multiple books, but bumps and uneven roads were constant threats. Extra padding and careful stacking were essential. By river, some journeys used boats or rafts, with manuscripts stored in waterproof chests, tied down to prevent sliding or tipping. Travel was risky. Water, mud, rough roads, or clumsy handlers could damage the most precious manuscripts. Monks often prayed or murmured blessings over books before long trips, just in case divine protection was needed. Handling protocols during travel, monks and couriers followed strict handling rituals to minimize damage. Slow, deliberate movements, no tossing, quick stacking, or careless flipping of pages, regular inspections during long journeys. Manuscripts were periodically checked for moisture, loose bindings, or insect activity. Limited exposure. Manuscripts were rarely opened mid-travel unless necessary for study or copying. Even small mistakes could mean weeks of labor lost to a single damaged page. Tracking and logging. Larger monasteries or universities often kept detailed ledgers, names of manuscripts, sent and received dates of departure, and expected return on condition before and after travel in some cases. Scribes annotated books themselves, adding travel notes in margins, sent to Abbey of St. Gallen. Year of our Lord 1451, arrived safely. Thanks be to God. These notes survive as tiny historical breadcrumbs for modern researchers. Risks and disasters traveling. Manuscripts faced a host of potential disasters. Accidents, spilled water, trampled parchment, or fire in a carriage could destroy weeks of work. Theft or loss, rare. But valuable manuscripts could attract attention. Hence chained libraries and sealed containers. Environmental hazards, sunlight fading pigments, moisture warping parchment, or pests sneaking into chests. Monks mitigated these risks with careful planning, ritualized handling, and sometimes sheer luck. Manuscripts as living objects while traveling. Manuscripts were treated almost like living beings. Monks spoke of them with reverence, handling them with hands washed and guided slowly over pages. Books were often carried in pairs or multiples for balance, much like fragile cargo. Arriving at their destination, manuscripts were inspected, logged, and stored carefully. Continuing the cycle of preservation, every journey reinforced the idea that a manuscript's survival depended not only on its initial creation, but also on a lifetime of patient, meticulous care, small moments of humor even on the road. Monks found tiny ways to amuse themselves, testing a quill on scrap parchment during rest stops, doodling tiny marginal creatures while waiting for rivers to cross, whispered jokes about overly fussy handling instructions, though always in silent, careful humor. These little distractions kept the tedious rhythm bearable, ensuring that both monks and manuscripts survived long journeys. We followed manuscripts from the very beginnings of parchment preparation, through ink making, copying, illumination, binding, storage, rituals, and even long journeys across Europe. And finally, we arrive at the quiet, enduring legacy of these medieval books, what they left behind and why they still capture our attention. Centuries later, survival through patience, the most remarkable thing about medieval manuscripts is their survival. Consider the materials. Parchment, made from animal hides, was sturdy but sensitive to moisture, heat, and pests. Ink, sometimes derived from iron salts and gall nuts, could flake, fade, or even corrode. Parchment over time. Pigments, gold leaf, and decorative flourishes were delicate, prone to abrasion or chemical reaction. And yet, so many manuscripts survive today, often in astonishingly good condition. This is thanks to centuries of patient care, monks who copied slowly, deliberately, and methodically handling that minimized wear and tear, careful storage in cupboards, chained libraries, or wrapped in linen repairs, performed gently whenever necessary travel, conducted with meticulous precautions. It's almost miraculous that texts written on sheep hides, with ink brewed from bugs and oak galls, are still readable 8, 9, sometimes 10 centuries later. A window into the past. Manuscripts are more than text. They're time capsules. They preserve historical knowledge, religious texts, law codes, medical treatises, and literature, artistic practice, illuminations, marginalia, and decorative flourishes reflect medieval aesthetics. Daily life, notes on repairs, margin doodles, and scribe annotations offer glimpses into the personalities and habits of long-gone monks. Every book is a record not just of its content, but of the human labor, patience, and tiny rituals that sustained it. Even the smallest doodle or note in a margin can tell us about a scribe's humor, boredom, or personality. Influence on modern libraries. Care and organization developed in medieval scriptoria influenced modern library practices. Cataloging, keeping ledgers and logs ensured manuscripts could be tracked. A precursor to modern library databases, preservation techniques, binding methods, careful storage, and controlled handling anticipate modern conservation practices. Standardized copying, precision in handwriting, consistency in text layout, and color coding inspired printing practices later on. In a way, medieval monks laid the groundwork for the long-term survival of knowledge, not through speed or efficiency, but through extreme patience, care, and ritualized attention to detail. Manuscripts as objects of wonder for modern readers. Manuscripts hold a special charm. The tactile feel of parchment and raised ink, the gleam of gold leaf reflecting candlelight, tiny marginal illustrations, often whimsical or bizarre evidence of centuries of human touch, fingerprints, smudges, and careful repairs. These elements remind us that books were not just vehicles of knowledge, but living objects, shaped by human hands, habits, and lives. The slow legacyber. Perhaps the most important lesson of medieval manuscripts is the power of slow work. Slow copying ensured accuracies, slow handling preserved the fragile pages, slow rituals, repetitive tasks, and deliberate care allowed manuscripts to endure in an age of instant printing and digital text. It's remarkable and almost soothing to consider a world where books required years of effort to create and centuries of care to survive. Each manuscript is a monument to patience, discipline, and quiet devotion. Closing thoughts. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine a medieval scriptorium, candlelight flickering over parchment, monks hunched over quills, carefully forming letters, gold leaf glinting, margins slowly filling with tiny doodles, books wrapped, stored, and occasionally sent on slow journeys across Europe. All of it quiet, repetitive, and infinitely patient. Every surviving manuscript is a whisper from the past, a testament to the care rituals, and slow rhythms of medieval life. And because of that, we can still turn the pages, feel the texture, and marvel at centuries of quiet human labor.